$109 billion. $109 billion is how much US VCs have poured into private AI investment in 2024, according to the Stanford AI Index report. $109 billion is 12 times more than China and 24 times more than the UK invested in the same category. It's a mind-boggling number, but it's not just the VCs pushing the AI agenda. In the next 18 months, regulators, geopolitics, and macro forces could decide which AI bets play off and which founders get steamrolled. The question isn't if AI will reshape markets, it's who will be allowed to reap the rewards. I'm Tom Chavez, and today I'm joined by George Lee, co-head of the Goldman Sachs Global Institute, former head of technology M&A, and CIO of Goldman Sachs. He's here to pull the curtain back on AI, geopolitics, regulatory blind spots, and the institutional shift that could make or break your AI play. George, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Tom. Always fun to talk to you.
Let's jump in here. So the US just outspent China 12-1, and we're headed towards distinct AI economic forces that fragment global markets. So I wanted to see if I could get your perspective on the relevance and the rise of the Middle East players in this arena. I know you've spent some time out that way and you have an informed perspective. Is this just sort of make-believe deal making from the Oval Office, or is it a more deep-seated, durable development?
Great. Well, let's talk about China for a second. It's like a fascinating topic. And I have to say, your number, that statistic is sort of startling to me. I think you have to acknowledge that transparency on those sorts of numbers emerging from China are sort of limited. One wonders whether that includes prior investments they made in fields like robotics and data and drones, et cetera, which have become a real strength for them. It also probably belies the investment that they've made in energy infrastructure, where they have a huge edge of abundance over many of the other parts of the world, certainly the US. And it's been fascinating actually to watch the Chinese journey with generative AI, in the sense that when it emerged in the wake of COVID, they expressed a lot of ambivalence, as a somewhat authoritarian regime might, by a probabilistic chatbot that can say things that are less controllable. Yet with the DeepSeek moment, one wonders whether this was before DeepSeek or afterwards, but they seem to have really pivoted in favor of embracing AI and leading in this area. And there's certain irony of this, which is, in particular, China is leading an open source and open weight AI, which also a little bit ironic given that a somewhat closed society. And yet they see this as an opportunity to really project power and influence around the world, particularly in the global South, and offering an alternative to what has been a very Western-dominated technology stack and approach that sort of echoes the early internet days. I think it's a really important geopolitical force for them. Now, the Middle East, where, as you say, I have spent a fair amount of time, I'm incredibly struck by the conviction, expertise, urgency, and ambition they express. And while it might be easy to dismiss Middle Eastern players as being long on money, short on knowledge, I found that not to be true at all, and been very impressed with, again, their conviction and the scope of their ambition here. And they have some real abundance to leverage themselves. They have an abundant amount of capital. They have an abundant amount of energy. And again, they have societies that can be organized rapidly and distinctly around priorities set by the rulers. And so, that in an environment and in a phenomenon that's shifting as quickly as this is and requires really fast and decisive action, that's a real asset.
So, George, speaking of the rulers, though, I'm curious to get your perspective because while they're not necessarily authoritarian regimes, they're not necessarily societies that, relish the chaos of Western free markets. And so I'm wondering, are the rulers willing to let things unfurl and play out, or is it an organized sort of top-down effort, at least today? What do you see?
Yeah, it's clearly more top down, and as I said, their bets can be both a feature and a bug. In a really fast moving, resource intensive phenomenon like this, and in a way, it's an advantage. Only time will tell whether that somewhat less democratic approach to this, hamstrings it ultimately. But again, this generation of rulers, in their own way, are extremely progressive, extremely ambitious, and see this as an opportunity to lead again in providing a resource that is sort of a motive power for the next industrial revolution. And so, again, quite compelling to spend time with them and understand their vision and see the kind of depth and the expertise that lies behind it.
Yeah. Hey, George, you've called AI development a canal and locks journey, which speaks to sort of the staging and sequencing that unfolds in the build out of a new category like this. Most founders, meanwhile, are just obsessing over the next model release. So, curious to kind of get your perspective. What stage do you think we're actually at right now, and what's next?
Yeah, I was struck by in the very earliest days of this, we identified this bottleneck of the availability of sufficient silicon to drive these systems. And then as that bottleneck was resolved, we started to focus on the fact like, okay, we've got that, but now we have a real dearth of advanced data center capacity. And then it became clear that we were going to have a real pinch point around energy. And then that became dependent on the supply chain that satisfies all of the priors. Then you get to certain regulatory things, which you mentioned earlier. And so it went from like a singular bottleneck vision in my mind to a canal where you're traversing a series of locks on your way to the open ocean. And I would say right now the pinch point or the most salient bottleneck is really around energy. And whether we as a country, other economies around the world can meet the moment to provide sufficient and appropriate power to, um, enliven these advanced AI data centers, which are massive energy consumers.
Hey, well, so speaking of that, AI is consuming vast amounts of energy, right, at a rate that exacerbates what are potentially already extinction level threats from climate change. So, what do we do about the power shortfall, and is there a solution within view?
Yeah, fascinating and an important question, the $10 trillion question. And just to put it in context first, the amount of power dedicated to data centers is expected to grow about 165% from 2023 to 2030. That will take the amount of the percentage of power of electricity that's dedicated to data centers from about 4% to somewhere between 8 and 12%. And so on the one hand, that's super meaningful, and I'll get to some context behind that in a moment. On the other hand, I was sort of surprised to learn that it was still probably single digits of overall electricity demand. It puts in context the scale of manufacturing, EV, and other uses of electricity, consumer use of electricity in the world. Now, one thing is that growth rate is already perhaps beginning to affect ratepayers. And I just saw a statistic today that said one of the grids in the US, wholesale electricity prices are up 22% year over year. This is in itself a constraining factor because as soon as this really starts to be felt by consumers, recall that most utilities in the U.S. are public utilities. They're regulated. They answer to ratepayers. They answer to PUCs, and so this is going to be one of the tensions as we expand the amount of energy dedicated to these data centers. And the broader context, I suppose, is the amount of energy consumed in the US has essentially been flat for 20 years. Um, Clearly, there's been industrial growth, new uses of electricity. We've just gotten much more efficient. We've also decarbonized and substituted, more durable, dispatchable sources of power to more intermittent sources of power. And so now we've got to scale up those resources. And the challenges of finding the know-how and experience sufficient to do that, run that playbook is, I think, in itself a little bit elusive. And so this raises the question, will the US be able to meet this moment? If not, will this demand for advanced AI data centers spill over to other geographies and countries, back to the Middle East and Canada and other places? And one potential solution to this, something we've been studying in the Global Institute at Goldman, is this idea that okay, the U.S. energy infrastructure is built for peak demand, those 95-degree days in Dallas or New York, whatever, when we're not operating at peak demand, there's enormous slack availability of electrons. At the same time, data centers are usually built to be continuous, high availability, five nines reliability, et cetera. If you could flex the latter and promote more flexible, demand sensitive management of AI workloads and curtail them in those peak moments and utilize those slack periods more effectively, one study out of Duke suggests that there's some 75 to 125 gigawatts of capacity that we could harness, and that wouldn't be a solution in and of itself, but it would be a really good temporal fix. And I just noticed today or yesterday, Google announced that they'd reached an agreement with a series of utilities to essentially affect this kind of plan where they're willing to flex the demand for AI workloads in data centers in return for more abundant and probably lower cost access to electrons in slacker periods. So this is something that's emerging that's going to take some algorithmic smarts to get around, but I think it's a quite promising, again, sort of temporary fix for this pinch point.
So what that means for me as a user of these AI systems is that I might have to wait 200 milliseconds longer to get that magical answer.
Exactly, though what's fascinating about this is the latency tolerance that users are already exhibiting for several reasons. So, you know better than I, the search world, the ad serving world, if something doesn't come up in point 0.6 seconds, you're out of there on to the next thing. And yet think about our use of chatbots. We ask a question, provide a prompt, they think for a little while, and then they fill in, and we're not as latency sensitive for this at all. And so that, that the inference tolerance, the time tolerance for inference is, I think, much slacker in this area. And then the second thing is there are a lot of workloads around AI that are subject to curtailment easily. Think about all the training runs, think about rejection sampling in reinforcement learning. All those things can be, snapshotted, shifted, curtailed, moved, et cetera. And so if you did that, you'd probably still have enough energy and bandwidth availability to satisfy inference demands. And even if those are slowed slightly, there's no evidence suggests that that reduces consumer utility.
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting, at least to me, that, whatever it was 15 years ago, Google spoiled us all. Remember, they used to, in their search results, they don't do it anymore, but they used to say, I just gave you an answer in 0.27 seconds, right? And it's like they were training not just their own organization, but the rest of us to expect it perfect and immediately. And now in AI, I think you're right. It's not the same level of speed that we require, but I can we're all spoiled and we all want it fast. We all want it perfect. We all want it now.
I don't know if your use case is like this, but I find this increasingly where I'll have several tabs open on a couple different chatbots or different sessions in existing chatbots and ask deep research queries and let them cook for 10 or 12 minutes. And the metaphor that comes to mind is the old like carnival gag of plate spinning. Where, guys would have poles and they'd start a plate spinning and then they'd go to the next one and then you go back to the first one. And sometimes I feel like my mode of work with these machines, you've got a coding workflow going on one, a deep research query on the other, and you kind of attend to them serially. So again, that doesn't suggest that we're going to be hugely latency sensitive the way we were in search world.
Yeah. Hey, George, I want to come back to something you touched on. You mentioned some of the regulatory implications and activities that are going on here. And of course, working at Goldman Sachs over so many years, you're really attuned to what it means to work um, in a regulated industry. So I'm curious to kind of get your perspective on, are there blind spots that could accelerate or completely derail institutional AI adoption? I and others like me worry about the completely unfettered mm, implications of of uh, of AI. I'm reading Empire of AI. I'm sure you've probably read that as well. Great book, eye opening as well as to some of the not so. positive mm, infringements and reckless behaviors that have happened in the training and creation of these models. So just kind of curious to get your general perspective on regulation and what it means for this space.
Yep. And you're right, as a regulated financial institution, we work super closely with our regulators. And, like in general, it's been a really positive cooperation. They recognize this is kind of a new paradigm for computation. Something you've written about, which is this is probabilistic computation in a world where regulators and businesses are used to determinism, that for a given input, you expect a correct, repeatable, and traceable output, and these systems don't work that way. So paradigmatically, this is a hard thing for regulators to get their heads around, but they've been really good and cooperative and collaborative as we go forward. I think the things that could really go wrong here in terms of regulatory blockers are we have some thermodoric reaction to a really bad event. And as the nature of regulation, of legislation is very headline sensitive. And so if there is, some sort of very untoward, very unfortunate event, you might see regulation scale back up really quickly in a way that's not entirely rational, but very reactive. Um, I worry a little bit about this prong that's emerging around woke criticism of so-called woke AI. And one of the reasons why AI is so important to nation states, the thing we talked about earlier is, AI could be very consequential for nation states' productivity, for defense, but perhaps most importantly for culture. If you think about these chatbots are a transmission mechanism for culture. Um, and so I think the White House and others have already begun to fasten their attention on this. And so regulation that seeks to really um, bound the outputs of these machines to hew to, um, a political or societal or cultural directionality. I think that could be very, very complicated. Perhaps the absence of that could also be complicated, but I worry about that from a regulatory perspective. But, overall, like I applaud and am grateful for regulatory attention in this space for the reasons you cited. It is a powerful new force. It's a new paradigm for computation. It's hugely consequential for nations, for enterprises, for us as consumers, and all the regulatory attention here, I think, is merited, and being imposed with the best of intentions.
George, you mentioned the aspect of non-determinism, which, in my job, it's a biggie, right? Where we build enterprise systems. By the way, with my friends, I urge them, hey, when you ask a question, people, regular folks who are just kind of coming into contact with LLMs or not using them as frequently, perhaps as you and I do, go and ask the same question an hour later or the next day, and you'll see that, oh my God, I got a really good answer yesterday, but I'm getting something completely different now. So this non-determinism is something that I think a lot of consumers aren't aware of, but it has huge implications for enterprise, right? If you're building an enterprise system, I need reliability, I need a steady signal. And so I'm kind of curious to drill in on that a little bit. We're coming up with tricks and heuristics and ways to attend to that challenge, but kind of curious to get your perspective on, is it a biggie? Will the waterline move and regular business workers say, "Yeah, well, I live in the age of AI, and this is just how, I'm gonna tolerate that non-determinism," um, or or are there workarounds that you're aware of that people who do what I do should be trying?
Yeah. I think it's a fascinating and broad topic, one I've thought a lot about, and so I hope I remember all the prongs of this discussion. But in the first instance, I think it suggests that the workflows and duties are, opportunities for generative AI in the enterprise really are focused around mostly human tasks today, and that opens a whole nother Pandora's box of issues. I think we'll continue to see transaction systems that are deterministic, true, repeatable, correct, and traceable persist. But there's a huge area under the curve of activities which we have to recognize these machines are kind of the most human of our creations. They inherit many of our foibles, many of our inconsistencies. If I asked you the same question 3 days in a row, you might give me 3 different answers. I've been known to emit a false
You
token
got me, George.
in a while. And so I think it's really suggests that these algorithms will be extremely fit for purpose for certain workflows in the enterprise, but not all. And that we have to find a way for deterministic systems and probabilistic systems to live together. And, look, this is one area where financial institutions may have a little bit of a leg up because we've long been users of machine learning and other probabilistic models to examine the world and develop a perspective of the world. And we have our own maturity model for how to wrestle with those. And they're very different than the deterministic systems. Deterministic systems, as you all know, you do a ton of work testing, non-prod, UAT, et cetera, to make sure a system works right. And you will continue to monitor it, but once it's working correctly, your expectation is it continues to do so. Probabilistic systems require more continuous sampling, testing, and there's almost like the difference between discrete manufacturing and continuous manufacturing. Like you're creating a line of oil products or food products or something where you have to continuously sample, evaluate, revisit, tune. And so it's just like a different regime of what the maturity model will be here. But I think they'll coexist. And again, I think the area under the curve for rote low value tasks that we ask humans to do today that can be accelerated and enhanced by the use of machines and thereby free up humans to do more, think more creatively, test more, have more ideas, test more hypotheses. I think that's the promise. And so I imagine a world of coexistence between these two regimes.
Makes sense. Hey, George, I want to switch gears here a little bit. You have possibly the coolest job on the planet where you get to talk to heads of state to understand how their societies evolve. Um, and I remember once you told me um, how AI, is sort of at the center of everything you do. I forgot this. I think you said something along the lines of understanding AI and its phenomenological implications for the world. I don't know if I'm getting it right, but it was approximately that. So now we're going to the balcony. What do you see as the global trends and emerging problem spaces for builders listening to this podcast to pay attention to if you have the ambition to build a company with truly global reach and scale?
Such a complicated time for that. And I would just echo again, um, AI is central to the national ambitions of almost every leader that we talk to and seen as deeply consequential. Second, look, every country, every region has their own eccentric areas of focus and concern. Those could be linguistic, those could be cultural, those could be, privacy oriented, et cetera. And what I worry about is I thought at one point we were headed to a set of relatively harmonic regulatory standards around the world. That tide seems to have rolled back a little bit. And so I think it's a tough message for builders, which it's likely that similar to all the things that you've lived through with data locality and sovereignty, et cetera, those concerns are going to be multiplied and amplified. And so building your systems to be globally available, globally relevant, globally compliant, I think is going to be, a real task. And I think in some ways people are going to have to pick their spots. And you're already seeing this even among some of the biggest companies who are demurring from making their services available in certain geographies because of unwillingness or inability to live to a certain regulatory standard. So complicated stuff for builders out there for sure.
So, George, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you were the head of technology M&A for Goldman Sachs. So you're an investment banker in recovery. I'm wondering if we could switch gears here a little bit. I'd love to get your perspective on tech M&A and how it relates to this space we're talking about. It feels to me like a pretty extreme concentration of market power in the hands of the behemoths, Microsoft, Oracle, Amazon, and major frontier models like OpenAI and Anthropic. So I was wondering if you care to share a few predictions or at least idle speculations about how the space shapes up. Who buys who? What flanks need to be shored up? What threats do the majors face? and how do they address all of these possibilities through M&A?
Great. Well, thanks. So yeah, I ran TMT investment banking at Goldman and did a bunch of M&A, a lot of IPO stuff. And so I'm more often just played an M&A guy on TV than actually being in the heart of the negotiations. That having been said, I've been around it for a long time. And this does feel like a unique moment in the sense that, um, you and I have both lived through a series of platform shifts, and they tend not to favor incumbents. This one, because of its resource intensity and because where the intellectual capital seems to be concentrated, it seems to be for now really benefiting those giants and behemoths that you described. And the big question is, will that continue, or is this all about the infrastructure building phase, and that the application phase or the phase of creating utility from these models will benefit other non-incumbents or certain incumbents over others? For now, I think the most interesting M&A phenomenon going in is the rise of acqui-hires and individual um, researcher contracts that exceed the size of most M&A deals that you and I have been involved with. And so that is it's a really extraordinary moment in time. In a way, it makes sense when you scope out to the numbers that you talked about. And, if you're spending $100 billion a year in CapEx and you believe a small team or one or two people can optimize or improve that by 1, 2, 3%, then some of these big prices may well make sense in that context. I would expect over time, as an application layer begins to flourish, that you'll see consolidation. I also think that over time, you'll see some separation between this cadre of leaders. That may be separation by dint of strategies. Certain people focus in areas. You've seen a little bit that with Anthropic, their deep focus on coding and engineering versus OpenAI. AI seems to be slightly more consumer oriented. And so you may see separation by strategy. You may see separation by dint of financial resources as the scope of this continues. And as that happens, I think you'll start to see people begin to express themselves through M&A. But so overall, our M&A backlog and activity is growing a lot. But the kind of most visible expression of that are these small acqui-hires or individual contractual deals. It's really remarkable.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, George, because yes, you and I have been at this for a bit, and I'm not going to be shy. I'm just going to share a quick perspective here. These multi-billion dollar acqui-hire deals, while very exciting to read about and see in the headlines of the papers, actually really worry me because the social contract that we've had in Silicon Valley for decades is one wherein, you join a startup, um, you throw your hat in the ring, you work really, really hard, and it's, as I'd like to say to the founders we work with, this is a mind, body, spirit, and family commitment, right? You got to be all in. And so what worries me about these deals is that it is kind of upturning that whole social contract, right? Wherein now, if you're not in the magic room of 40 people, I guess it was 40 at Windsor or something like that, well, the remaining 200 plus go jump in a lake, right? And so I don't know if that's good for innovation. I worry about the reverberations of that over time. Um, it changes the risk-taking attitude for people who think about joining these companies and their families for that matter. So it worries me. I'm curious to get your perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question and kind of exacerbates or is an expression of the have and have not separation that we deal with in society broadly. There's a great podcast, actually, odd to promote one podcast on another here, but Lots did something recently with the guys from TBPN where they talked about kind of the sports culturification of engineering, where you have people who are paid like sports stars, and because similarly they command a set of economics or promote a set of economics that is in proportion to that. And so, yeah, it's sort of a fascinating way to look at it. And like you, I do worry about the social contract of, yes, the prominent researchers and leaders here have enormous agency and impact on these companies, on these models, on the opportunities, on the economics. But you know as well as anyone that, a company thrives because of the efforts of every single person who shows up every day or shows up virtually every day. And so, I hope that we get to a place where the spoils are shared more equitably. On the other hand, maybe this is overdue in our society, which is we've been rewarding sports stars and movie stars in a, seemingly in a mad with massive economic payoffs. And, you know, thinking about the world's best engineers who create systems that are capable of solving some of the really consequential global problems feels to me in some ways equitable and appropriate that they enjoy some of the same economics. Now, again, well, I hope they enjoy those economics. I also hope that the rank and file are, we find a way to reward the rank and file because, as you know, building a company is a complete team sport, notwithstanding the talents of a LeBron-like engineering talent at the heart of it.
Yeah. No, that's a really apt point. Well, listen, George, let's switch gears here. I want to move to our lightning round, where I'm just going to ask you a bunch of quick hitting questions about your perspective on global AI and other things. Are you ready?
Got it.
Let's jump in. So, what's your take on Musk's Grok breakthrough, and do you think it could actually threaten OpenAI's enterprise dominance?
I mean, my reaction is there's a breakthrough every day. I mean, today, actually, in the last 24 hours, we had OpenAI open models, we had Claude 4.1, and we had a release of Genie 3 from Google. And so we just seem to be in this escalating race. And so declaring supremacy of one of these models over another, I think, is a very short temporal phenomenon. So I think it really the spoils are going to go to the team that can durably and continuously and reliably just climb the ladder of excellence around these models.
Speaking of that, is Anthropic's $4 billion revenue run rate durable, or is it a local optimum?
I mean, I get two things. First of all, I think you have to stand back in awe of the fact that this is a phenomenon that is less than, the public facing dimension of generative AI is 3 years old. And you have companies doing $4 billion of revenue from a standing start 2 years ago, more revenue from a standing start than that. And it's sort of extraordinary to imagine. I do think that we all should be a little bit gimlet-eyed about some of those numbers in the sense that think about back to the enterprise. We're really early. This is really immature. And someone smarter than me came up with this styling of there's ARR, annualized recurring revenue, and then there's ERR, experimental run rate. And I think we have to be cautious about what's the separation between the two. But, these markers, whether it's 4 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion, whatever, they are an indicator that the uptake and the appetite for these models is extraordinary. I would finish it something I just saw in the Wall Street Journal, which is the Stanford economist Eric Brynjolfsson and a set of colleagues did a study where they're trying to get to this question of what's the consumer surplus that these models are generating. It's not, you might say it's not really showing up yet in GDP and productivity. And the way they went about that is they went to a panel of users and said, "How much would I have to pay you to give up this capability?" Which is really a fascinating thing. By the way, they'd have to pay me a lot at this point. I'm completely hooked. And they came up with a consumer surplus already, which was nearing $100 billion. Um,
Wow.
and so, I think all of these numbers, well, again, you have to be a little bit gimlet-eyed as you always are in the early stages of these revolutions. I think a lot of it's real, and I think the potential is remarkable.
Should founders be worried about Google's aggressive push to get everyone off NVIDIA and onto TPUs?
Look, I think in some ways the extraordinary dominance of NVIDIA and the CUDA ecosystem, it's a challenge for builders because it creates a certain price umbrella and so forth. And there are a lot of people creating merchant silicon and um, other people like Google and Amazon and others trying to dent that market share. It's going to be a fascinating journey, and NVIDIA just has to be applauded for the incredible work they've done, and the cadence of improvement is like startling. Um, but in a way, a natural ecosystem would demand a more balanced supplier set. So it's going to be fascinating to see. But it is, Google, Amazon, AMD, others are going to take a real run at this.
Hey, George, switching gears now. If you weren't in finance, if you hadn't worked at Goldman Sachs all of these years, there's a parallel world. What are you doing in it?
Well, it's funny, amid the cavalcade, the intensity, the velocity of this thing, sometimes I feel like retiring to our farm on the Sonoma coast and becoming a shepherd or something. 'Cause, man, it's just hard to keep up with. But as you say, I think we both are incredibly fortunate to be at this moment in time, observers, participants in something that as really has the potential to reshape the way we interact with the world, the problems we solve. So, not sure I'd trade it, but, probably something you and I talk a lot about, which is, one of the things about this platform, Amin, is the chance to write and reflect about this, and so being a communicator or writer, something like that would probably be what I would default to.
One final one here, George. So AI is transforming industries. I wonder to get your perspective on, will it transform investment banking? Do you think that AI can replace or supplant what seasoned investment bankers or other less seasoned investment bankers do?
Yeah, it's a great way to end the pod, because I'll give you 2 optimistic lenses on this. One, I mentioned this earlier, we have one of the privileges of working at a place like Goldman Sachs is the intellectual capital and that we get from campuses, the junior people we hire, their capability, their ambition, their smarts. I mean, it's humbling every day. And yet we ask them early in their career to perform a series of relatively rote and sometimes low value tasks. To the extent those are swept away, abstracted, performed by a machine that allows us to take advantage of the intellect of the young people on our platform, I think that will be amazing and great for everyone involved. Second, they will lead us. I mean, the young people joining us from campuses today have been habituated to using these machines as companions, thought partners, et cetera. And so bringing that to our enterprise is really, really powerful. And then finally, and you've been a client, so you'll understand this. We get a call from a client, and they say, "Look, we've got a problem. We want you to help us solve, or an ambition we want you to help us fulfill." And we sometimes say, "That's great. Give us a week or 2 and we'll come back and, bring you a book or a presentation or something like that." Think about a world in which the cycle times of that are compressed, where it's like, "Oh, what an interesting question. Do you wanna meet tomorrow afternoon?" And because we've swept away, automated, compressed many of the road tasks associated with answering that question, we get that material almost immediately, and we spend the next 24 or 48 hours reasoning about the data we have, coming up with new ideas, testing hypotheses. Boom, we're in your office, and you haven't had to wait a couple of weeks. I think that this, in some ways, is like the central utility of these systems. It'll challenge us, and we'll solve a lot of problems at the same time. But this time dilation that comes with the ability to leverage these systems to respond much faster to problems and opportunities. So, look, I think it'll have a really salutary effect on the ability of bankers to provide value to clients. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's a really encouraging view, and it stands in contrast to a lot of the more dystopian takes on that topic. It makes an awful lot of sense, George.
Yep. I mean, the one thing I would say is one truism about investment banking business, your implication is this question of like, will we ever hire another junior person again, et cetera? And my one truism of 30 plus years in investment banking work is a little bit like, I think it's Boyle's law, where, gas expands to fill the container. We will find ways to use human capital to answer questions, come up with opportunities, ideas, and solve problems for clients. And there'll always be more surface area of things that we can think about and do for people. I think there's persistently going to be demand for people with great judgment, ambition, and moxie.
Absolutely. And listen, that pertains equally well to what I do in my day job. We were with a number of younger developers just the other day, and I was asking him, how many of you guys are on Cursor and like platforms? How many of you are using AI for code generation? Hoping to hear something like at least 60, 70% of the code that they're generating is enabled by these AI helpers. the number was more like 90, 95%. And these were our youngest engineers.
Right.
So when you read it, when Meta and other companies are saying we hope to cut 30, 40% of our junior or mid-level engineers, it really kind of skirts the dynamic that you're calling attention to, which is, well, no, what if, especially these young folks are so much more adept and agile in the adoption of these new technologies. What if you just did more cool shit faster, smarter, better?
Totally. When you think about the companies you've built, and there's always an appetite for more features, more breadth of the platform, new market opportunities, new ways of expressing the value of the software. Like, I just think that appetite I mean, history dictates that appetite tends to outrun these phenomena. So, knock wood, it's very uncertain. There's no clear answer to this, but, we hopefully share an optimistic lens on it.
I'm right there with you. Well, that wraps up this episode of the Closed Session podcast. Many, many thanks to George Lee, co-head of Goldman Sachs Global Institute, for joining us today. If you'd like to contact George, you can find a link to his LinkedIn profile in our show notes or at closedsessionpod.com. You can also visit George's company website at goldmansachs.com. If you haven't subscribed yet and want a regular stream of research and insights in your podcast feed, hit that subscribe button right now or follow us on YouTube. That's all for today. Until next time, keep building, keep cranking.